Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm going to do my wrap-up of Jane Austen July. It's not yet halfway through August, so I don't think it's too late. So Jane Austen July is a wonderful annual read-along that is hosted by Katie at Books and Things, Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, and Claudia at Spinster's Library, in which we read and celebrate all of the wonders of Jane Austen, and I'm very grateful to these co-hosts for bringing us this annual reading delight. I have quite a lot to say because I always say a lot about Jane Austen. I have made copious notes about various things that I've read. So my plan is that rather than working through the prompts in order, I'm going to work from the things I have least to say about through to the things that I have most to say about. So least to say is the adaptation, so the watching prompts. I normally try to watch an adaptation of the major novel that I'm reading for Jane Austen July, which was Sense and Sensibility this year because it was the group read. But I watched the Sense and Sensibility miniseries relatively recently as kind of like a cosy winter watch, and I don't really like the film very much, so instead we watched Emma, the 2009 adaptation starring Romola Garai and Johnny Lee Miller. For me, this is the best adaptation of Emma. It's the most faithful to the plot whilst at the same time being like modern and fresh, and they make Emma just really nice and lively and thoughtless, and accurate to her character without emphasising her pride and meanness, which sometimes comes across too much in adaptations. For me, Jane Austen July always has a kind of little hangover into Austen August, and this month I have started a rewatch of the amazing, wonderful, classic 1996 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. I felt in a bit of a need of an emotional comfort blanket, and this series has always been an emotional comfort blanket for me. There is so much that is wrong with this adaptation in terms of the way certain characters are portrayed, or just adaptations of bits of dialogue that don't quite work, but at the same time it has become such a massive cultural touchstone for adaptations not only of Jane Austen but of any kind of period drama, any kind of classic work that's being brought to screen. Has a lot to thank this adaptation for, and yeah, I'm just enjoying going back to the wonderful scenes with Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth, kind of sparring through the slightly grainy 1996 video quality. The other watching prompt is to watch a modernised adaptation. I didn't do that at all this year, so I feel like I've done Jane Austen July loyally frequently enough that I can now discount certain prompts that if I'm not so interested. In previous years I have spent a lot of time watching some of the like YouTube series adaptations, things like From Mansfield with Love, the Lizzie Bennet diaries. I have enjoyed them a lot, but they are definitely a very big time sink, and this year I just didn't really have the time and energy to commit to that, and the other modernised adaptations like Bridget Jones's Diary or Clueless I just didn't really fancy, so I skipped that section. Next one, Jane Austen July's other writings or sort of minor works. So the group reads for this year were Sanditon and the Watsons, so her two incompleted novels. I didn't decide to do that just because I read both of them several times, and I feel like I'm getting diminishing returns when I reread them. There's no payoff at the end. You don't have the enjoyment of completing the story and seeing everything kind of wrapped up. There's not enough of the text to kind of get the depth that you can get out of her major works when you reread them. You don't think, oh, I didn't notice that before, because there's not enough to notice, but you do just get the frustration that it's not edited as well as it normally would be, and it just cuts off. So yeah, there's less enjoyment there. So instead, I'm taking a break from revisiting those. I read some more of Jane Austen's letters. So this year I was specifically looking for references to pregnancy and childbirth, which there are plenty of. Sorry, I've got a squeaky dog in the room. And for the video that I did on pregnancy and childbirth in the time of Jane Austen, which I will try to link at the end. Sorry, I'm just getting distracted by the dog. And yeah, I enjoyed them. I love her vivacious writing style. I love the humour in the letters, and I love how the seeing her writing style in the letters helps you to appreciate what her writing style is like in the books. But I never really feel drawn back to them, so I think it's going to take me a very, very long time to finish those letters, but that's okay. That's my plan. My plan is that every July for the rest of my life I'll read a couple of Jane Austen's letters, and that's all right by me. If I can spin them out, they might last a bit longer as well. Next section then is retellings and historical fiction set in the time of Jane Austen. I read 3 books for this prompt, so I didn't skimp on this one. The first one was The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet Witch by Melinda Taub. I got this from the library, so I don't have it to hold up. It's not great literature, but it is fun and irreverent. It's actually one of my most enjoyed Jane Austen retellings, just because it's not trying too hard to be Jane Austen. Like some retellings like Longbourn or Unequal Affections, they feel like they're taking themselves a little bit too seriously. This one definitely didn't, and I just loved to have Jane Austen's world turned into this kind of fantastical setting, and this explanation for Lydia's erratic behaviour being that she's got magical powers. It was just fun. I filmed a separate review for this book, and I will try to link that again at the end in case you are interested. The next retelling that I said I finished 3, but that's a complete lie. The next one that I started to read was called Sense and Sensibility by Joanna Trollope. It made so little impression on me that I forgot to even add it to my pile of books. I didn't finish it, and I'm not even counting it as a DNF because I only read the first 2 chapters. I honestly just didn't really see the point. I believe this was commissioned by a publishing house because it was some kind of Jane Austen related anniversary. I have read one other in the set that they did, which was Northanger Abbey by McDermid, and yeah, it was the same kind of thing. It's just a retelling put into a modern setting, without any of the kind of love of Austen that you would get from somebody doing this as like a real work of kind of fan fiction. I just stopped because I had better things to read. I'm not saying that I'll never read it at some point, but I think there are better options out there. The final one that fits into this category that I read was The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery Hurst. This was by Katie Lumsden, as in the Katie of Books and Things, who was also a co-host of Jane Austen July. So this is historical fiction set just after Jane Austen's time, so into the start of the Victorian era. Jane Austen was not a Victorian author, and it always slightly bugs me when people say that she was. But it does have a lot of Jane Austen's themes in it, and it's got a lot of character development, and it kind of acts as a response to the traditional marriage plot, which in many ways Jane Austen herself was responding to. I did this as a buddy read with Roz from Scandalous about the books, and we did a separate discussion video, which again I will link. So that gets me through all of the ones that I can kind of discuss quite quickly, partially because I've discussed them elsewhere. The next section is to talk about a book. Well, the next prompt that I'm coming on to is to talk about a book by a Jane Austen contemporary, The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet, which draws in a character called Miss Lamb from Sanditon, who is described as being mulatto, as in mixed race or a woman of colour, and that inspired me, in some of the comments in the author's notes section of that book, inspired me to get hold of this book, which is The Woman of Colour, a tale by an anonymous author. So this came out, oh my god, I didn't actually look up exactly when it came out. It came out during Jane Austen's time. It will say it on the front page here. Oh god, no, apparently not. And it is purportedly written, I can't find it. I'll put it in the description. So this edition was edited by Lyndon J Dominique, and it's a recent kind of reissuing of the book, because it had been out of print in the UK for a while. So this is an epistolary tale by an unknown author, and that author is often thought to be either a contemporary woman of colour, as in the title, who wouldn't have lived the exact, like, not that it's autobiographical, but that they would have some of that lived experience, or by an abolitionist. I had quite complex feelings about this book and these theories. I would say that if you're looking for a true discussion of Regency views on the slave trade, you will get kind of an inkling of almost as much of that from Mansfield Park, and we all know that it's there in Mansfield Park, but it's not very detailed, as from The Woman of Colour itself. And indeed, like, between Mansfield Park and The Woman of Colour, that you have similar themes of a woman being sent away from her home because her family decides to dictate her choices. when we're talking about this book in terms of abolitionism, I would say that slave owners are really not very criticised. So the main character, called Olivia Fairfield, her father is a slave owner, and at best he's a seducer of her mother, who was one of his slaves. After his daughter's birth, he apparently intends to free his slaves and become like a virtuous man, but somehow 20 years later he dies without having had the opportunity to do so. I don't really see why it would take you 20 years to be able to free your slaves. Maybe I'm just not understanding the context of the time, but I think that he is set up to be this good character, but he isn't. His will then dictates that his daughter Olivia has to travel to England and become dependent on her white relations for guidance for the rest of her life, so not really trusting her to have her own independence, whether that is by marriage or by guardianship of her. And yet he's still kind of presented in the text as being this caring father and a good man, and she's still kind of like grieving tragically for the loss of her wonderful father. I feel like if you were a real abolitionist, you would have more complex views on this man. I don't know, it just confused me a little bit. I also felt that there was quite an undercurrent of colorism in this book, in that while Olivia is held up as like a paragon of piety and good conduct to her black servant, Dido is given a very limited and stereotyped presentation, and that reminds me of a similar black servant character in Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. In both of those cases, I felt as though the author couldn't have any real personal connection with these characters, otherwise they wouldn't have portrayed them in such a simplistic manner that really like played into the stereotypes of the time in terms of ideas of excessive loyalty, inarticulate speech, are like really quite undermining and unpleasant, I would say, when you compare them to texts that were actually written by freed slaves like Ulada Rekuanu or something like that from the time that people were able to be very educated, very articulate. So yeah, so there was that for me. So definitely Olivia's arrival into English society is on some levels very radical and very disruptive. The very end of the book, on the other hand, without giving any specific spoilers, it involves like a return to the status quo, and that seems to completely undercut or belie any of the controversy. So it's like English social values are challenged by this young woman's appearance and by aspects of the text. But in many ways they seem to win out over any suggestion of change or development. So yeah, the idea that this book was written in a way that was meant to be radical, I find complicated. Just on the subject of spoilers, I would say that with this edition, in the blurb and also in the Amazon description, you are going to very immediately come across some significant plot spoilers that I found affected my enjoyment of the book. It's not always the case that a spoiler will spoil your enjoyment, but in this case I felt that my ideas of the book were damaged because I had been given this plot summary effectively. So skip that if you don't want that to happen to you. So what this book reminded me most of was a book like Evelina, for instance, by Frances Burney, in that the main character, it's more about having an outsider character, so a naive, innocent, super virtuous young woman who is there just to kind of criticise or provide a mirror to the social vices of the time. So interesting, challenging and very different the way that this book does it compared to Evelina. Evelina's just like somebody from the deep countryside who's been brought up very in very strict virtue. But both of them are just this kind of like super virtuous young woman who then gets kind of thrust into society and then has to judge everyone around her, basically. And I felt like she was more an archetype of that character than an archetype of creating anything, than being made to create anything new. I would be interested to know if anybody else has read this and if what they felt about it. Obviously, a lot of people who know a lot more about this than me have written various essays on the fact that this might have been written by an abolitionist or somebody who did have that heritage. So maybe I'm missing something, but I just felt that it didn't quite have what I expected it to have. I'm still very, very glad that I read it because I clearly had a lot to think about it and to say about it. So yeah, it was still a good choice. definitely thought-provoking. I would say that the intro of this edition is very, very academic. I can't remember if I already said that. It's kind of targeted at people who are studying this text. So yeah, I didn't read the whole of that just because it was a little bit too dense for me at this point. Speaking of things that were more on the academic side, I'll move on to the non-fiction read that I had for Jane Austen July. And this year I started What Jane Austen's Characters Read and Why by Susan Allen Ford, and this was published in 2024 by Bloomsbury Academic. So I didn't have a particular plan for this prompt at the start of the month. I was just going to kind of see what I felt like and if I had the time really, but then I was visiting Bath, very timely visit to Bath, just to see a friend, and I saw this in Mr B's bookshop, and I just thought, I read the title and I thought this is definitely the book for me. And it's also the book for you if you are another avid participant in Jane Austen July. Sorry, I just need a sip of water. So I wouldn't have this as your first or even your second Jane Austen related non-fiction. This, like, it wouldn't be like on your first year of Jane Austen July. This book is for you if you have read all 6 of the major novels and you have already gone questing for more among Jane Austen's contemporaries. So you might have read The Mysteries of Udolpho, you might have read some of the romance poets, and you've probably read at least one Jane Austen biography, like one standard Jane Austen biography and one book kind of generally around her time period. I think if you've got that basis, then this book will be good for you. And if you are somebody that does Jane Austen July every year, then absolutely I would put this on your list. I haven't finished it yet simply because I'm finding that it's a book that I need to read and then reflect on and kind of spend some time absorbing what Ford is saying and making up my own mind about her points. But I definitely will finish it, and I will kind of keep reflecting back on it as well. So Ford starts out by looking at Jane Austen's own reading, including sort of how she obtained her books in terms of family libraries, circulating libraries, and how she read them, so communally and alone, and the annotations and commentary that she made about inside books and in her letters sort of about books. She then goes on to pick apart various references to books within the stories themselves, and this is where it becomes truly fascinating. I'm going to give just 2 examples of how this can make you think quite differently about Jane Austen's books based on the 2 major works that I read this year. So I mentioned already that the first major work that I read was Sense and Sensibility because it was the group read. I wasn't an active participant in the group read sort of discussions. I generally don't really manage to do that participatory part of Jane Austen July, but I do always try and read along with the group read just to be kind of part of it at a distance. So this year I read the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike, which is what I have done the last couple of times I've reread Sense and Sensibility. I really like it as an audiobook. I find it very comforting. There's a theme here with Jane Austen and comfort for me. So in Sense and Sensibility, the Dashwoods are portrayed as a family of readers, and Marianne in particular seems to be heavily influenced by her love of poets like Cooper and Thompson, who would have been very well known at the time for readers of Jane Austen. So when she meets Willoughby, one of the first things that they bond over is their mutual admiration of these authors, and it says, you know, the same passages were admired by each. However, contemporary readers would have been aware that these poets often wrote very critically in their works of hunters, characterising them as cruel and often uncaring. So what is Willoughby? Aside from the professed lover of Marianne, he is a hunter. So his first appearance is as a gentleman carrying a gun, and all Sir John Middleton can say about him is that he is a very decent shot and not a boulder rider in England. So immediately we have this hint right from the start that hunting is very important to his character. This is pretty much the Jane Austen equivalent of striding onto the scene waving a big red flag, if you know what these poets say. And Marianne should pick up on, like, if she loves these poets so much, she should pick up on the fact that Willoughby is appearing in this character of being a hunter. And that's Ford's point, is that Marianne kind of misses that, but we as readers shouldn't do that. And indeed we do later discover that the man who can be cruel and thoughtless towards the animals that he's killing can also be cruel and thoughtless towards the women that he supposedly cares for. Multiple women, all of the women in his life, he is really quite horrible too. So that got me thinking about Jane Austen's men, and while it's true that we do see a lot of the heroes as hunters on occasion, so we certainly see Charles Bingley and Captain Wentworth hunting every now and then, to be over interested in hunting is a marker of either dullness, so for instance Charles Musgrove in Persuasion, he's a dull man who goes out shooting a lot, or Sir John in Sense and Sensibility, as already sort of mentioned, or altogether worse character traits like John Thorpe. Hey, yeah, shh, it's okay. Like John Thorpe in Northanger Abbey. So hunting, essentially for Jane Austen, it was an acceptable gentlemanly pursuit if it was not done to excess. But when people express or are suggested to be kind of hunters before anything else, then that is a sign for us that they are probably not the good guys. So I found that quite interesting. So then later on I started on a rereading or re-listening of Pride and Prejudice because I just got tempted, and mainly actually because I started reading about Pride and Prejudice in this, and it just got me wanting to revisit it again. So I again had that as an audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike. This audiobook is not so good. I think she goes a bit overboard on the character voices and they're a little bit annoying at times, particularly Mrs Bennet, particularly at the start when there's a lot of dialogue from Mrs Bennet. It gets quite wearing. But yeah, just based on what Ford was talking about, in Pride and Prejudice, the classic book that is mentioned is Fordyce's Sermons, which was a very widespread and well-known conduct book for young ladies. And it's mentioned only in passing as Mr Collins chooses to read from it, and then Lydia Bennet interrupts him because she can't stand the dullness of what he's saying. But in fact, basically Ford persuasively suggests that the whole of Pride and Prejudice is in a way in dialogue with Fordyce's Sermons. So it responds to his views on wit in women, conjugal felicity, and even the famous section on what it means to be an ideally truly accomplished young woman. These are all ideas that Fordyce has been discussing in the sermons, and we see that. It's interesting because at the time novels were thought to be not very educational, not very informative for young women, but it's almost like she's making her novel also a conduct book, but not in a negative way, but just showing how this conduct could be really lived in society, or not, as the case may be, like times when she thinks Fordyce is maybe wrong and times where she almost seems to support what he's saying. So reading about that definitely added another dimension to the text for me as I reread Pride and Prejudice this time. Right, so that has been everything that I read for Jane Austen July / Austen August this year. And many of my thoughts, I could have gone on for longer, but I tried to keep it a little bit shorter. I wanted to know if you read any of these, what you thought of them, how much you enjoyed Jane Austen July, if you've got anything to sort of respond to in terms of what I said about any of these, and if you're planning to read any of them in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and yeah, take care.